34 people are dead in southern Japan right now, and the number the Japan Meteorological Agency put on the shaking itself is the highest their scale even goes, Shindo 7. That's not a magnitude, that's an intensity reading, and it means that in two towns in Kumamoto Prefecture, the ground moved so violently that people couldn't stay on their feet and concrete walls came down. That happened Tuesday afternoon, July 28th, and while almost every camera in the world was pointed at Kyushu, something quieter was happening back on the other side of the Pacific, in California, where the ground has been talking too, just in a very different voice. Today I want to walk you through both of these honestly. What we actually know about Kumamoto as of this morning, why it happened the way it did, what the historical record tells us about what usually comes next there, and then I want to pull the lens back to California, because there's a narrative floating around right now that these two things are connected, and I want to show you exactly why that's not how any of this works, using the actual mechanics instead of just telling you to trust me. Drop where you're watching from in the comments, especially if you're in Kyushu or anywhere on the California coast, because that kind of real-time, on-the-ground feedback genuinely helps this channel track things faster than the wire services do. Let's start with what's confirmed. At 16:27 Japan Standard Time on Tuesday, July 28th, an earthquake struck southern Kumamoto Prefecture on the island of Kyushu. The epicenter sat just east of the city of Uto and south of Kumamoto City itself, at a shallow depth of roughly 10 kilometers. The Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, gave it a preliminary magnitude of 7.1. The U.S. Geological Survey, watching the same event from the other side of the ocean, using a different set of seismic networks and a different magnitude calculation method, put out its own preliminary number at 6.8. I want to flag that discrepancy honestly rather than smooth it over, because it's a good entry point into how this science actually works in real time. JMA and USGS use different algorithms and different station networks to estimate magnitude in the first hours after an event, and those numbers frequently diverge by 2 or 3 tenths before they converge on a final, reviewed figure days or weeks later. Neither agency is wrong. They're both giving you their best estimate with the data they had in that moment, and if you're used to seeing a single tidy number attached to an earthquake, that's usually because you're seeing it well after the fact, once the scientific community has had time to reconcile it. What isn't in dispute is how hard the ground shook. JMA's Shindo scale, which measures felt intensity rather than the energy released at the source, hit Shindo 7, the maximum reading on the scale, in the municipalities of Uki City and Hikawa Town. That is a genuinely rare reading. Japan Times reporting on the ground noted this was the first Shindo 7 recorded anywhere in the country since the Noto Peninsula earthquake in January 2024. At Shindo 7, people cannot remain standing, unsecured furniture is thrown into the air, and reinforced concrete structures can fail outright. A strong Shindo 6 was recorded across a wider band, including the cities of Yatsushiro and Uto, the towns of Mashiki and Misato, and the Minami ward of Kumamoto City. 2 minutes after the initial shock, JMA issued a tsunami advisory for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, the two bodies of water that flank the Kumamoto coastline. That advisory was lifted at 18:10 JST, roughly an hour and 40 minutes later, once tide gauges confirmed the wave activity wasn't building into anything dangerous. I'll get into exactly why a crustal quake like this one almost never produces a large tsunami in a few minutes, because that's directly relevant to some of the misinformation already spreading online. The human toll is what makes this a story rather than a data point, and I want to be precise about how that toll has moved, because watching a death toll update in real time is uncomfortable, and pretending it's static would be dishonest. In the first hours after the quake, CNN and Al Jazeera were reporting roughly 13 to 14 confirmed deaths, based on statements from Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. By Wednesday, that had risen to 18, according to Al Jazeera's continuing coverage. As of Thursday, July 30th, Japan's Fire and Disaster Management Agency, the FDMA, put the confirmed death toll at 34, with 123 people injured and more than 267,000 residents still under evacuation orders. I want to be blunt with you. That number is very likely to move again by the time you're watching this. Search and rescue operations in partially collapsed structures routinely surface additional fatalities days after an event, and the FDMA itself has been updating this figure roughly once a day. Treat 34 as the number attributed to Thursday morning's report, not as a final tally. Part of what's driving both the injury count and the emotional weight of this story is a shopping mall. The Aeon Mall in the town of Kashima experienced what witnesses described as an explosion on its second floor shortly after the main shock, followed by a partial ceiling and facade collapse. NHK, citing police sources, reported that between 20 and 30 mall employees were initially unreachable. Kumamoto police told local broadcaster RKK that many fatalities were expected from that collapse specifically. CNN later confirmed at least 3 workers at the mall had been killed, with a total of 5 deaths confirmed inside the complex and 3 more people unaccounted for at that point in the timeline. NHK's reporting attributes the explosion to a likely gas leak rather than any secondary hazard, which matters because I've already seen some framing online suggesting something more exotic was involved, and there's no credible reporting supporting that. The strain on the region's medical system was immediate and severe. Al Jazeera's on-the-ground reporting in the first hours noted that one hospital in Uki City, near the epicenter, was unable to function at all after losing power in the quake, while another hospital in the same city suspended new admissions after it had already taken in 86 injured patients, including 3 classified as seriously hurt, and could not safely handle any more emergency cases. More than 8,800 people had left their homes for over 400 emergency shelters by that point, and utility crews were working to add air conditioning capacity at those sites, given how dangerous a power outage becomes during Kyushu's summer heat. Passengers aboard high-speed trains running through the region at the moment the quake struck were also among the injured, according to rail operators cited in that same coverage. The mall wasn't the only structure that failed. Nippon Paper Industries plant in Yatsushiro lost a chimney that collapsed and was found cut cleanly in half by the shaking, with several employees unaccounted for in the hours immediately after. Kumamoto Castle, one of Japan's most storied historic sites, and a building that was already significantly damaged in the 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes, sustained further damage to its outer walls, according to footage geolocated by NBC News. And in Yatsushiro, a surveyor named Michishu Nakatsu, speaking to Reuters at the ruins of a temple, said the damage there would probably be assessed as a complete loss, noting that many of these wooden temple structures are especially vulnerable to shaking, with entrance gates and bell towers collapsing across the region. The government's response moved fast, and this is a place where the name source detail actually tells you something about how seriously Tokyo is treating this. A response office was stood up at the Prime Minister's official residence within 1 minute of the quake, at 1628. By 1820, the same evening, an extraordinary disaster management headquarters had been established, chaired by the Prime Minister directly, which is not a routine designation. Japan's self-defense forces initially deployed around 3,600 personnel. At a press conference the following morning, the defense minister raised that figure to roughly 4,600. Prime Minister Takaichi, addressing reporters as the search continued, said plainly that every second counted for people still trapped, and later offered condolences to victims' families while urging residents to be careful of the ongoing summer heat, since tens of thousands of homes were without power. Now let's talk about why this happened, because the mechanism here is genuinely interesting, and it's also the key to understanding why this event, as serious as it is not the doomsday scenario some corners of the internet are already trying to attach to it. Kumamoto sits on Kyushu, which is riddled with a dense network of crustal faults, the most significant of which for this event is the Futagawa-Hinagu fault zone. This is a strike-slip system, meaning the 2 sides of the fault are grinding past each other horizontally, rather than one side thrusting up over the other. Picture 2 pieces of sandpaper being dragged past each other under enormous pressure, rather than one board being shoved on top of another. That horizontal side-to-side motion is important because it's directly why the tsunami advisory here was brief and the wave threat was minor. Tsunamis are generated primarily by vertical displacement of the seafloor, water getting physically pushed up or dropped down over a large area. A strike-slip rupture, even a large one, doesn't move the seafloor vertically in the same way a megathrust subduction event does. Some vertical component can still occur, especially near a coastline, which is why JMA issued the advisory as a precaution. But the physics of this fault type simply doesn't generate the kind of large, sustained wave that a subduction zone quake can. That's a real and important distinction, and it's worth understanding on its own terms rather than as a talking point. This region has done this before, and recently enough that the comparison isn't academic. 10 years ago, in April 2016, the same fault system produced a 2-part sequence that devastated this exact area. A magnitude 6.2 to 6.4 foreshock struck on April 14th, killing 9 people and forcing roughly 40,000 evacuations, according to Al Jazeera's reporting at the time. Tohoku University professor Shinji Toda, speaking to NHK in the immediate aftermath, suggested that quake might itself be a foreshock of something larger, and he was right. Just over a day later, in the early hours of April 16th, a magnitude 7.3 main shock struck the same region at a depth of about 17.5 miles, and this is the event most people mean when they refer to the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake. Al Jazeera's continuing coverage put the combined death toll from both shocks at 41 in the days following, though the wider, longer-term toll from the 2016 sequence, once indirect deaths from evacuation-related illness and stress were included, ultimately rose to 273 killed and roughly 2,739 injured, with thousands of buildings damaged, including, notably, the same castle walls that were damaged again this week. The lesson Japanese officials clearly took from 2016 is one they're applying right now. In this fault system, a large shock is not necessarily the end of the sequence. It can be a precursor to something bigger following within a day or two. That's exactly why the messaging out of Kumamoto this week has been so insistent about aftershock vigilance rather than relief that the worst has passed. Japan's Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism reported, in its fifth situation report, that 48 earthquakes of Shindo 3 or greater had already been recorded by noon on July 29th, roughly 20 hours after the main shock. Of those, 1 hit Shindo 7, 3 hit Shindo 5 lower, 11 hit Shindo 4, and 33 hit Shindo 3. That's a genuinely active aftershock sequence, and it follows a pattern seismologists describe using something called Omori's law, which says aftershock frequency decays roughly in proportion to the inverse of time since the main shock. In plain terms, the number of aftershocks drops off fast at first and then more slowly, like a bouncing ball losing height with each bounce. But it doesn't drop to zero on any fixed schedule, and given the 2016 precedent in this exact location, officials are not treating "it's been a day and nothing bigger has hit" as evidence that nothing bigger will. I do want to plant a flag on the honest uncertainty here, because a channel like this one is only useful to you if it doesn't pretend to know things it doesn't. Nobody, not JMA, not the USGS, not any named seismologist quoted in the last 3 days of coverage, can tell you with confidence whether the July 28th shock is the main shock of this sequence, or a large foreshock the way April 14, 2016 turned out to be. The aftershock statistics I just walked you through describe probabilities, not certainties, and the honest position, which is also the position Japanese emergency management is operating from, is heightened vigilance without false alarm. Let me give you a second way to picture that fault mechanism, because one analogy rarely does the job on its own. Think about the Shindo 7 reading specifically, not just as very strong shaking, but as a description of acceleration. At that intensity, the ground itself is briefly accelerating faster than objects can keep up with through friction alone, which is why unsecured furniture doesn't just tip over, it becomes briefly airborne, and why door frames rack out of square fast enough to jam. Now compare that to the way the same energy would have moved differently on a thrust fault, like the kind that produced the catastrophic 1923 Great Kanto earthquake beneath Sagami Bay, a magnitude 7.9 event that killed an estimated 105,000 people, most of them not from the shaking itself, but from the firestorms that swept through wooden Tokyo and Yokohama in the hours after. That quake generated far more vertical ground motion over a wider area precisely because it was a thrust event, one plate shoved up and over another, not two blocks sliding past each other. The takeaway isn't that strike-slip quakes are safe. Tuesday's death toll is proof they aren't. It's that the type of fault motion shapes the type of damage you get, tsunami risk and building failure included, and lumping every big Japan earthquake into one mental category flattens distinctions that genuinely matter for understanding what's coming next. Now let's talk about what radiates outward from Kumamoto beyond the disaster zone itself, because a quake this size doesn't stay contained to the prefecture it struck. Kyushu is a significant industrial and agricultural region, and the Nippon Paper Industries plant in Yatsushiro, the one that lost its chimney, is not a minor operation. Paper and pulp manufacturing along that stretch of coastline feeds into packaging and logistics chains that extend well beyond Kumamoto Prefecture, and plant shutdowns for structural inspection after Shindo 6+ shaking typically run into weeks rather than days. Regional rail was hit immediately. Bullet train, Shinkansen, service through the area was suspended within minutes of the quake, stranding passengers at Hakata Station in Fukuoka, and disrupting a transit corridor that carries both commuters and freight across Kyushu. Tourism is its own ripple category here, and a particularly visible one, given that Kumamoto Castle, already a partially reconstructed landmark from the 2016 damage, has now been hit again. An account associated with the castle confirmed it was closed for the day as a precaution, even before officials could fully assess whether the outer walls had suffered new structural damage, and a historic site that took nearly a decade to partially restore after 2016 is now facing renewed uncertainty about its recovery timeline. Then there's the insurance and rebuilding dimension I'll come back to in a moment, because it connects directly to the California half of this story. Bloomberg Intelligence's early loss estimate of roughly 175 billion yen isn't just a number for adjusters. It's a signal to construction firms, building material suppliers, and temporary housing providers across Kyushu that a sustained rebuilding effort, likely running well into next year, is about to begin. Which brings me to the first myth I want to knock down directly because it's already circulating. No, this earthquake is not evidence that the long-feared Nankai Trough megathrust earthquake is starting. The Nankai Trough is a subduction zone running along Japan's Pacific coastline well to the east and south of Kyushu, where the Philippine Sea Plate is diving underneath the Amurian Plate. That's a completely different tectonic structure from the shallow, crustal, strike-slip Futagawa-Hinagu system that produced Tuesday's quake. A crustal strike-slip rupture on Kyushu doesn't load stress onto the Nankai Trough megathrust in any way that current seismological understanding supports. They're not mechanically coupled systems. Conflating "a large earthquake happened in Japan" with "the Nankai Trough is rupturing" is the same category of error as assuming any earthquake in California must be the big one on the San Andreas, which, conveniently, is exactly where I want to take you next. Now let's shift over to California, because this is where I need you to actually sit with the mechanics rather than the headline. Here's the honest starting point. California has not experienced a single dramatic, headline-defining earthquake this week. What it has experienced is what seismologists would call ordinary background seismicity, just slightly elevated in visibility because of one notable event a little over a month ago. On June 24, 2026, a preliminary magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck Mendocino County, centered about 7 miles north of Redwood Valley and roughly 15 miles south of Willits, at a shallow depth of about 8 kilometers, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. That depth matters in the same way it mattered in Kumamoto. Shallower earthquakes concentrate more of their energy at the surface, rather than dissipating it through more rock, which is part of why the USGS assigned this event a maximum shake map intensity of 7, very strong, and issued a yellow pager alert, its designation for likely limited but real damage. The Press Democrats on-the-ground reporting described cracked home structures, caved-in roofs, broken water pipes, and knocked-out power to roughly 8,000 PG&E customers in the area, along with some injuries, though county officials confirmed no deaths. Rancher Janet Pauley, quoted in that coverage, said the shaking was strong enough to knock her off balance outdoors while oak trees swayed violently around her. USGS physical scientist Robert Michael DeGroot told KTVU at the time that a magnitude 5.6 event like this one statistically produces aftershocks up to magnitude 4.0 in the following days, and that living in this part of the state means living in earthquake country, plainly, and without dramatics. That event, in USGS's own sequence tracking, has since been logged as the main shock of a broader sequence, with 237 individual events cataloged as part of it as of late June. Since then, California's seismic network has continued doing what it always does, recording dozens of small earthquakes a day across the state. In the 30 days leading into this week, the tracking service Earthquake Track logged 49 magnitude 2.5- or greater earthquakes across California, only 3 of which broke magnitude 4.0, the largest being a magnitude 4.3 near Johannesburg, California. On the same days that the world's attention was locked on Kumamoto, California recorded small, unremarkable events near Borrego Springs, Cobb, and Mammoth Lakes, none above magnitude 2, the kind of seismicity that happens in this state essentially every single day of the year and that almost never makes the news. So here's the second myth I want to correct directly, because the premise embedded in a headline like "California began shaking while the world focused on Japan" implies a connection that the actual science does not support, and I'd rather walk you through why than just assert it. There is no known physical mechanism by which an earthquake on Kyushu, roughly 8,700 kilometers away across the Pacific Ocean, triggers seismic activity on California faults on a timescale of days. Static stress transfer, the mechanism by which one earthquake can nudge a nearby fault closer to failure, operates over distances of, at most, a few fault lengths, typically tens to a few hundred kilometers, not entire ocean basins. Dynamic triggering from passing seismic waves has been documented at much longer range, including some studies suggesting large teleseismic waves can occasionally trigger small, shallow seismicity or geyser activity thousands of kilometers away, but that effect, where it's been observed at all, shows up as a brief burst of very small, already primed microseismicity, not as a driver of a magnitude 5+ main shock a full month earlier. The Redwood Valley sequence started on June 24th. The Kumamoto earthquake happened on July 28th. California's ordinary background seismicity did not begin because of Japan. California has never stopped shaking because it sits directly on the boundary between the Pacific and North American plates, hosting the roughly 1,200-kilometer San Andreas fault system and dozens of connected structures that produce seismicity constantly, with or without a headline-generating event on the other side of the planet. What is true, and worth taking seriously without needing a fake causal link to Japan to justify it, is that California's underlying hazard picture is genuinely severe, and officials talk about it in those terms regardless of what's happening anywhere else. Christine Goulet, director of the USGS Earthquake Science Center, has put it about as plainly as a scientist can. A major California earthquake is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. And she's been explicit that nobody can currently say whether that's minutes, hours, or years away. The Hayward Fault running through the East Bay, home to roughly 8 million people, has what scientists estimate as a 150-year average recurrence interval for major ruptures, and it's now 158 years past its last major rupture in 1868, which is part of why seismologists frequently describe it as the most dangerous urban fault in the country. Statewide seismic hazard assessments put roughly 16 million Californians and an estimated $3 trillion in building value inside extreme seismic hazard zones. None of that required a nudge from Kyushu to be true. It's been true for decades, and the Shake Alert early warning system that covers the West Coast exists specifically because officials know they're working against a clock they can't read. It's worth putting the Redwood Valley sequence in a longer historical frame because Mendocino County has produced genuinely major earthquakes before, and the comparison shows you what a real worst case looks like there versus what actually happened in June. In April 1992, the Cape Mendocino earthquake struck the Lost Coast area not far to the north, a sequence that began with a magnitude 7.2 thrust fault main shock on April 25th, followed within a day by two more major aftershocks measuring 6.5 and 6.6. That sequence happened near the Mendocino Triple Junction, the complex meeting point of the Pacific, North American, and Gorda plates, where the San Andreas Fault, the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and the Mendocino Fracture Zone all converge, and it produced over 2,000 aftershocks in the following weeks, total damage estimated between $48 and $75 million, and a peak ground acceleration around 2.2 times gravity. That's what a genuine major event in this part of Northern California looks like. A fundamentally different tectonic setting from the strike-slip system in Kumamoto, since this triple junction involves actual subduction, plates diving beneath one another, which is exactly the kind of geometry capable of producing significant tsunami waves, and did in 1992. June's magnitude 5.6 event, by contrast, released roughly 1/1000th of the energy of a magnitude 7.2 quake like Cape Mendocino, since the energy released by an earthquake scales up by roughly 32 times for every whole point of magnitude. That scaling relationship is worth sitting with for a second because it's the same logic that makes JMA's 7.1 versus USGS's 6.8 estimate for Kumamoto matter more than it might sound. A difference of 0.3 of a magnitude point represents a real, measurable difference in radiated energy, even though both numbers get rounded off in casual conversation to a 7. There is, however, one place where Kumamoto and California genuinely do belong in the same conversation, and it's not seismology, it's money. Bloomberg Intelligence estimated that insurance claims from the Kumamoto earthquake could exceed 175 billion yen, roughly $1.1 billion, which would exceed the average payout from Japan's 6 previous major tremors. And Japan, according to that same reporting, has roughly 70% earthquake insurance coverage among households, an extremely high rate by international standards, built specifically because a country that lives with this level of seismic risk chose, as a matter of policy, to build an insurance system to match it. California's earthquake insurance uptake sits far below that, commonly estimated in the range of 10 to 15% of homeowners, depending on the survey, a gap that means a comparable disaster here would land on far more uninsured households. That's not a seismological fact, but it's arguably the most consequential difference between how these two regions would actually experience the same kind of earthquake, and it's worth sitting with. If you're in California, or honestly anywhere that shakes, this is the actual, boring, useful thing to do with that information. Check whether your homeowner's or renter's policy includes earthquake coverage. Because standard policies in the US typically do not, it's almost always a separate rider or a separate policy through something like the California Earthquake Authority. Beyond the paperwork, the same basic preparedness steps USGS scientist Robert Michael DeGroot pointed to after the Redwood Valley quake still apply, regardless of what triggered your attention to the topic this week. Heavy furniture and top-heavy bookshelves should be anchored to wall studs. Water heaters need proper strapping since they're a common source of both injury and post-quake fire risk from ruptured gas lines. And every household in a seismically active region genuinely benefits from a go bag with a few days of water, any needed medication, a flashlight, and copies of key documents, kept somewhere you can grab it without thinking. If you're on the coast anywhere near a subduction zone, whether that's the Pacific Northwest's Cascadia system, or, for anyone watching from Japan's Pacific coastline, the Nankai Trough itself, know your evacuation route to higher ground before you need it, because a real subduction zone tsunami, unlike Tuesday's brief advisory, can arrive within minutes rather than hours. And if you've got family in Kyushu or anywhere in Kumamoto Prefecture, or you know someone who tends to panic first and check facts second when a big quake makes headlines, send them this video, because the myth correction on the Nankai Trough point specifically is the kind of thing that can quiet a lot of unnecessary fear fast. And the same goes for anyone in your life who's already convinced that a shopping mall in California is somehow next because of what happened in Japan this week. So what should you actually be watching in the days ahead? In Kumamoto, watch the FDMA's daily situation reports for the confirmed death toll and the evacuation order count, both of which have been updated roughly once every 24 hours, and both of which are likely to shift, hopefully downward on evacuations as infrastructure gets restored. But the death toll specifically may still climb as search efforts continue in the mall and other partially collapsed structures. In California, there's honestly less to watch in the sense of an unfolding event because there isn't one right now beyond ordinary background seismicity. What's worth tracking instead is the same thing that's always worth tracking here, whether Shake Alert delivers timely warnings the next time something bigger does hit, and whether your own household actually has a plan, because California's hazard doesn't announce itself with a countdown. If you want a genuinely useful number to keep an eye on in the Redwood Valley sequence specifically, USGS's own aftershock forecasting for a magnitude 5.6 main shock typically estimates something in the range of a 5 to 10% chance of an even larger earthquake occurring in that same sequence within the following month, a number that drops off the further out from June 24th we get without a larger event materializing. To close this out, let's be honest about what this week actually is and isn't. It's a genuinely severe, still developing disaster in southern Japan, with a death toll that has more than doubled in under 48 hours and will likely climb further before it stabilizes, sitting on top of a fault system with real, dated, 10-year-old precedent for delivering a second major blow within days of the first. It's also, completely separately, an ordinary month of background seismicity in a U.S. state that has never stopped producing small earthquakes and never will, for reasons that have nothing to do with what's happening 8,000 kilometers away across the Pacific. These are two genuinely different stories that happen to be sharing a news cycle, not two chapters of the same event. Kumamoto is a real, ongoing, deadly disaster with a death toll that's still moving, and a fault system with real historical precedent for delivering a second, larger blow within days. California is living, as it always has, on top of some of the most studied and most dangerous fault systems on the planet, seismically active on any given week, whether or not the rest of the world happens to be watching. Treating them as connected doesn't make either one better understood, it just borrows drama from one to inflate the other. I'd rather give you the real picture of both. I'll keep tracking Kumamoto's numbers as they update, and I'll flag it the moment anything genuinely changes in California too. So if that's useful to you, subscribing means you get that update the second there's something real to report, not a manufactured one.